Welcome back. House Republicans are looking at the massive midterm battlefield for this fall and realizing they need to make some tough choices. Republican officials are telling Politico already that as many as 45 of their seats are at serious risk, and there's no way they can save each one with limited resources. So it's becoming survival of the fittest. Incumbents at risk right now of being cut off from Republican Party help include, and we're in August and they're saying this publicly, Virginia's Barbara Comstock, Pennsylvania's Keith Rothfuss, and Iowa's Rod Blum. That's in the Northeast District there, not the Des Moines District. Now, Comstock has been preparing for a tough race from the start, but the odds are against her in a district that went for Hillary Clinton by 10 points and Democratic Governor Ralph Northam by 12 points. And in another sign of the expanding battlefield and how Republicans are sort of triaging at this moment, President Trump announced today he's going to hold a rally for Republican Senator Ted Cruz in Texas. Joining me now, NBC News national political correspondent Steve Kornacki, and our panel is back, Matthew Continetti, Shana Thomas, and Howard Fineman. All right, Steve, so let's put up the fact that we're triaging now, that we're seeing this decision. Normally, we know the decisions get made now, but we don't hear about it until about October 1st.
Right.
Does that mean more are coming?
Yeah, first of all, I was looking back. I was trying to put this in some perspective. In 2010, the wave when Democrats lost control of the House back then, how many races did the Democrats end up cutting their incumbents loose? And I think the number ended up about 8, where they either cut it off altogether or started paring it back, and that was around Columbus Day of 2010. So, yeah, I'd imagine there's more. Comstock is such an obvious one. Not only did Hillary Clinton win that district by 10 points, they've actually, Monmouth, a pretty good pollster, has been doing some of these House race polls. They have her running at 39% right now, running 10 points behind her Democratic opponent. So that one that's a very obvious one. It's starting to wonder about the tougher choices they face with all of those incumbents in those expensive markets in California, Southern California in particular, a bunch in the New Jersey, Philadelphia, even in some of those New York districts. So probably some tough decisions there, too, coming just because of the cost, if nothing else.
I was just going to say, should we go major market by that? So, for instance, we know Miami, the Ileana Ross-Leighton District, Donna Shalala, that's probably one that's on there on the don't fund block. Expensive Miami. You brought up Philadelphia and New Jersey. Might we see something in Denver, for instance?
Yeah, that's the way I start to look at it. Like I said, there are 7 Republican incumbents in California in districts that Hillary Clinton won. Some of them are in more of the sort of the Central Valley, Fresno area. But you get down into the San Diego, Orange County, Anaheim, L.A. area around there. Extremely expensive. You look in New Jersey, Leonard Lance, embattled Republican incumbent right there. You got to buy New York television time to get into that district. Even, there's an open seat there where Rodney Frelinghuysen is leaving. I think there's a question there. So, yeah, extreme cost in some of these cases.
Howard Fineman, one of them that looks like it's on the chopping block is Rod Blum, and he's the first district Republican congressman in Iowa. And what's interesting about that district is, on one hand, it is a traditionally labor union district, always sort of the heart and soul of the Iowa Democratic Party at times. But there's a Trumpy feel to it at times, too. The fact that Iowa, that this one's early on the chopping block, that would have me nervous in every Iowa district if I were a Republican.
Oh, I think so. And I think Iowa has become a sort of classic swing state.
It's back vacillating back. It seems to be.
It's now back in that category, and I think that's very, very important. I think the one in Western PA is too. Because don't forget that unlike some of the other places, that really was Trump country in this last election. Outside of Allegheny County, which is Pittsburgh, every county in Western Pennsylvania went for Trump. The fact that they're thinking of giving up, that the Republicans are thinking of giving up on that race there, not the one that Connor Lamb won, but next door, I think is quite significant because it shows Trump country can be vulnerable for House members who won in those areas.
All right, I got to bring up the decision that Cruz feels like he needs Trump in October. So they're looking for, I think Donald Trump tweeted, the biggest stadium possible. We've calculated that if you go by stadium, it would be the Taj Mahal there, the AT&T, where the University of Miami will be LSU on Sunday night. Or it's the Texas Motor Speedway, which actually seats a lot more but isn't really a stadium. But what does it say that Ted Cruz, the man who said this about Donald Trump?
This man is a pathological liar. He doesn't know the difference between truth and lies. He lies practically every word that comes out of his mouth. The man cannot tell the truth, but he combines it with being a narcissist. A narcissist at a level I don't think this country's ever seen. Donald will betray his supporters on every issue. If you care about immigration, Donald is laughing at you. He will betray you on every issue across the board.
Matthew, what this really tells me is Ted Cruz has a Trump voter problem. It's not a swing voter problem that he may have in Texas. It's a Trump voter problem.
That's right, and because you left out his remarks at the convention.
Oh, I left out something?
Vote your conscience.
You're right.
Right. So his beef with Trump continued even past that date you showed, which the Republican nomination was effectively over. I think this, obviously everyone's going to be looking at the Texas Senate race. Beto O'Rourke is a very telegenic candidate who would have kind of vault to the presidential contenders if he somehow pulls off this upset.
I'd like to do, how about one campaign at a time? But I hear you.
I also think, though, the campaign hasn't really started there yet. I mean, just today there was some reporting out of Houston about a DUI that Beto had some decades ago, but you have this sense of a candidate who's received a lot of positive media, not any opposition, especially in the air yet, and conversely, Ted Cruz is being kind of held aloft by a pretty high rating among Hispanics. Right. And I wonder whether those numbers will go down once Beto hits the air.
Steve Kornacki, it seems to me that one of the triage, one of the MASH unit doctors is actually Donald Trump. Where he'll be used the most is to do things like this: shore up. Go to West Texas, where they love him there, for instance, Lubbock or whatever, but shore up shaky incumbents where Trump can actually help.
Well, yeah, and I think in that sense he becomes a lot more useful to Republicans when it comes to Senate races, potentially, than it does to House races, just because the battlefield for the Senate side is being waged in so many red states, so many Trump states. You know, a Trump going into a West Virginia, say, or a North Dakota, Missouri, Indiana, Texas to try to prop up Ted Cruz. There are a lot of options there, I think, where you've got a significant number of Trump voters where you could really kind of tap into that, I think, as a Republican, with less of a risk of the sort of backlash potentially you have in some of these more swingish House seats that are out there.
Shauna Thomas, you're our Texan here at the table.
Yes.
You know, Houston native.
Yes, born and raised.
Beto he's a phenomenon outside of Texas, and I guess we're trying to figure out, is he a real phenomenon inside of Texas?
I think so. I mean, I think the interesting thing is, and I believe Abby Livingston of the Texas Tribune wrote about this recently, about seeing lots of signs, yard signs for Beto outside of Texas. So there's something coalescing around him, and he would be the best example, if he were to win, of turning something blue because of Donald Trump. The other thing Beto has done, and we've covered him a lot at Vice News, he has gone to a lot of little towns that Democrats, and this is pre-primary, a lot of little towns that Democrats in Texas usually ignore because the Democratic Party in Texas hasn't really been a thing in a long time.
By the way, you're describing the Andrew Gillum campaign in Florida.
I am, and I can get to that, too.
But no, it is Citrus, the same story with him. Yep. He was showing up in places that people hadn't gone before.
People didn't go, and Beto has been all across the state, and it's, if I can go to a bar and get 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 Democrats who didn't used to tell people they were Democrats to show up, if I can get enough of those people out, plus the big cities of Texas, then maybe we got something.
Howard, very quickly, last word.
There isn't enough for Donald Trump to go around. That in Kentucky, there's a House race where they desperately want Donald Trump to go into Lexington to save Andy Barr. Just for that one House race? Is he going to do it? Probably not. He's not going to have enough time.
Senate matters more to his future than the House does.
Totally.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.